The fence post sat crooked in Eleanor Hayes's hand like a broken promise. She'd been trying to hammer it straight for 20 minutes, but her grip kept slipping, fingers betraying her the way they'd been doing for months now. The tremor started small in her right hand, barely noticeable except when she held a coffee cup or tried to thread a needle. Now it was climbing up her arm like an unwelcome visitor, making itself at home. 76 years old, and her body was conducting its own quiet rebellion. She set the hammer down and flexed her fingers, willing them steady. The Oklahoma sun beat down on her shoulders, May heat already thick enough to chew. In the distance, the wheat fields rolled gold and restless under a sky that couldn't decide what color it wanted to be. Not quite blue, not quite gray, just that peculiar in-between shade that old farmers called trouble weather. The fence marked the eastern edge of her property, 17 acres of red dirt and stubborn grass that she and Robert had bought 49 years ago when the land was cheap and their dreams were expensive. They'd built the house themselves that first summer, Robert handling the heavy lifting while Eleanor mixed mortar and made sandwiches and pretended she wasn't terrified of the vastness of the prairie stretching away in all directions. She'd been terrified of a lot of things back then, of failing, of disappointing him, of not being enough. Funny how those fears never really left, they just learned to whisper instead of shout. The fence post tilted again, and Eleanor cursed under her breath, words Robert would have frowned at but secretly enjoyed. He'd always liked it when she swore said it meant she was fighting back against something. She grabbed the post with both hands and shoved it into the hole she dug, packed the dirt around it with her boot. It would do for now. Everything would have to do for now. Behind her, the house waited. White clapboard siding that needed paint green shutters, one storm away from hanging crooked, a porch that creaked like old bones when you walked across it. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the air conditioning rattled like a dying animal every time it kicked on. It was falling apart slowly the way old things do when there's no one left to maintain them properly. Robert would have hated seeing it like this. But Robert was 3 years gone, buried in the cemetery on the east side of town under a headstone that read, "Beloved husband, honest man." The second part had been her addition. The funeral director had looked at her strangely when she'd insisted on it, but she'd paid cash and he'd shut up. Honest man, that's what everyone had called Robert Hayes. Honest to a fault, her mother had said at the wedding, and Eleanor hadn't understood what that meant until years later when she realized honesty could cut as deep as any lie. Their last year together had been hard. Not because of the cancer that had been slowly eating away at Robert's heart, though that had been bad enough. It had been hard because they'd fought about the house. He wanted to sell it, move into one of those assisted living communities in Oklahoma City where someone else would handle the maintenance and the cooking and the endless small emergencies that filled their days. Eleanor had refused. This was their home, their land, their life. "You're being stubborn," Robert had said, voice thin with exhaustion as he sat at the kitchen table with his pill organizer and his water glass and his resignation. "The house is too much for you alone." "Then don't leave me alone," she'd snapped back and immediately hated herself for saying it, as if he had a choice, as if his dying was some kind of betrayal. They hadn't spoken for 3 days after that. 3 days of loaded silence and separate rooms and meals eaten, standing at the counter, because sitting at the table together felt like admitting something neither of them wanted to face. And then Robert had woken up one Tuesday morning, made coffee, and said, "I'm sorry. You can keep the house if it makes you happy." But he hadn't sounded sorry. He'd sounded defeated. Eleanor had forgiven him. Of course she'd forgiven him. What else could she do? You don't hold grudges against dying men, but she'd never forgotten that resignation in his voice, that quiet surrender to her stubbornness. It sat between them like a ghost even after he was gone, especially after he was gone. Now here she was 3 years later, alone with a crooked fence post and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and a house that was slowly consuming itself through neglect. Robert had been right about one thing: it was too much for her. But admitting that felt like admitting he'd won their last argument, and she'd be damned if she'd let him win after he wasn't even here to gloat about it. She picked up the hammer again, and this time her grip held. Small victories. That's what life became after 75. Small victories and smaller defeats in the occasional afternoon where you could almost forget how lonely the silence had become. A sound drifted across the fields, then faint but growing. Not thunder, though the sky was dark enough for it. Not wind, though the air had that pre-storm weight to it. It took Eleanor a moment to place it engines. Multiple engines coming from the highway that ran along the northern edge of her property. She turned, shading her eyes. The sound grew louder, closer, until she could make out individual notes in the symphony of machinery. Motorcycles. A lot of them. Eleanor frowned. The highway occasionally got traffic from the nearby Air Force Base military personnel heading to and from duty, but this didn't sound military. It sounded wrong, urgent, like something running rather than simply traveling. The first bike appeared around the bend where the highway dipped below the overpass. Then another. Then 10, 20 more, a long, snaking line of them, all moving fast, too fast for the posted speed limit. She could see them clearly now against the darkening sky, leather and chrome catching what little light remained. And she could see the patches on their backs. Even from this distance, even with her aging eyes, she recognized the symbols. The skull, the wings, the letters that spelled out a reputation, Hell's Angels. Eleanor had never seen one in person before, but everyone knew about them. They'd made the news a few times over the years for various reasons, some charitable and some less so. Robert had strong opinions about motorcycle clubs. Gangs, he'd called them. Organized crime wrapped in Americana and engine grease. Eleanor had never been quite sure what she thought. They'd always seemed like something from a different world, one that didn't intersect with her quiet life on 17 acres in rural Oklahoma. But here they were, a whole convoy of them tearing down the highway like hell itself was chasing them. And then Eleanor looked at the sky behind them and realized something was. The clouds had been building all day, that peculiar greenish gray that Oklahomans learned to respect. Tornado weather. She'd seen it 1,000 times over the decades, had sheltered through more twisters than she could count. Usually there was time. Usually the sirens went off early enough to give you warning to let you grab the essentials and get underground. But no siren had sounded. Eleanor frowned, looking back toward town. From here, she could just make out the top of the water tower and mounted on it the tornado siren that had been there for as long as she could remember. Silent, completely silent. Maybe it was broken. Maybe the town council had finally let the maintenance lapse, the way they'd been threatening to for years, budget cuts and fiscal responsibility, and all those pleasant phrases that meant no one wanted to pay for safety until it was too late. Or maybe it wasn't broken at all. Eleanor shook her head, dismissing the thought. No time for paranoia. She turned back to the highway and the motorcycles and the sky beyond them, and her breath caught. The tornado was there, not forming, not building, but there, fully realized and bearing down like the fist of an angry god. It was massive, a wedge of black fury nearly a mile wide, chewing up the landscape with methodical violence. She could see debris spiraling in its wake, pieces of buildings and vehicles and lives spinning like prayer flags in a demonic wind. It was coming straight for them. The motorcycles weren't running from law enforcement or rival gangs. They were running from death itself, and from the look of it, death was gaining. Eleanor stood frozen for one long heartbeat, her mind trying to process what her eyes were showing her. The tornado was perhaps 3 miles out, maybe less. At the speed it was moving, it would hit her property in minutes, maybe less than minutes. The smart thing would be to run, get to the basement shelter Robert had insisted on building 10 years ago after the big twister that had leveled half of Moore. Lock herself in and pray the house above stayed mostly intact. But as she watched the motorcycles draw closer, she could see details now. The riders hunched low over their handlebars, faces turned back toward the storm, fear evident even from this distance. And one bike, smaller than the others, wobbled dangerously as if the rider was barely holding on. 79 people. She counted them without meaning, to an old habit from her teaching days. 79 souls about to be caught in the open when that monster arrived. Her chest tightened. Not with fear, not exactly. With something Robert had called her hero complex, with equal parts affection and exasperation. That stubborn refusal to look away when someone needed help, even if helping meant putting yourself at risk. You can't save everyone, Ellie, Robert had said once after she brought home a stray dog that turned out to be rabid. They'd had to put it down and she'd cried for a week. Some things are meant to happen. But she'd never believed that, never accepted that some people were just meant to suffer while others stood by and watched. It was that belief that had driven her into teaching, that had kept her working until her knees gave out and the school board forced her into retirement. That belief that you could make a difference if you just tried hard enough. Robert had loved her for it, but he'd also worried it would get her killed someday. Eleanor looked at the basement entrance, the storm door angled into the earth like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Then she looked at the motorcycles closer now, close enough that she could hear individual engines over the collective roar. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. It was instinct. She ran, not toward the basement, but toward the road, her boots slipping in the dirt, her hands trembling with more than just Parkinson's now. She reached the edge of her property, where the fence met the highway, and grabbed the rope that still hung from the old bell post they'd used for dinner calls back when she'd had hired hands helping with the farm. The bell was rusty, hadn't been rung in years, but when she yanked the rope, it sang clear and sharp across the prairie, cutting through the growing wind. And she shouted, "God help her," she shouted with everything she had left in her aging lungs, basement tornado. The lead motorcycle saw her first. The rider's head turned, eyes widening behind the visor, and then the bike was braking hard, skidding slightly as it pulled into her driveway. The others followed like a choreographed dance of chrome and leather engines, snarling as they cut speed and turned. Eleanor was already moving before the first rider dismounted, heading for the basement entrance, throwing open the storm doors with both hands. They creaked on hinges that hadn't been oiled in months, but they opened, revealing concrete steps leading down into darkness. She turned to face the approaching riders, and her first clear thought was how absolutely insane this was. 79 members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in America descending on her property while a tornado bore down on them all. If she survived this, the story would be unbelievable. If she survived this. The first rider to reach her was a man tall and broad-shouldered, with gray threading through the hair that stuck out from under his helmet. His patch read Marcus, and beneath it President. He pulled off his helmet and looked at her with eyes that had seen things, the kind of eyes soldiers came back with after tours in places the news stopped covering. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough with wind and fear, and something that might have been respect. "You sure about this?" Eleanor pointed at the churning black wall advancing on them. "You see another option." He looked, and she saw his jaw tighten. Then he nodded once sharp and decisive and turned to the others who were pulling into her yard in a controlled chaos of bikes and bodies. "Everyone down," Marcus shouted. "Now single file, no pushing." They moved fast, faster than Eleanor would have expected from a group that size. There was discipline there, military precision under the leather and attitude. They filed down the concrete steps into her basement, helmets, underarms, boots, loud on stone voices, tight with barely controlled panic. Eleanor stood at the top, counting them as they passed. 40, 50, 60. A woman with a long blonde braid grabbed Eleanor's arm as she passed, squeezed once hard, then disappeared into the dark. A younger kid, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, looked up at her with eyes so wide she could see white all around the iris. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking. 75, 76, 77. The wind was picking up now, no longer just a presence, but a force shoving against Eleanor's back like impatient hands. Debris began to fly past, small things at first, leaves and dirt and paper, then larger, heavier objects. A road sign tumbled across her yard like a thrown toy. Something metal shrieked in the distance, the sound of a building giving up. 78, 79 and Marcus at the end, waiting his hand out to help her down. "Ma'am," he said again, but this time it wasn't a question. Eleanor looked one last time at her house, at the white clapboard siding that needed paint and the porch that creaked, and the life she'd built here over 49 years. Then she took Marcus's hand and let him guide her down into the basement where 79 strangers were waiting to survive or die together in the dark. The storm door slammed shut above them with a sound like thunder, and for a moment absolute silence filled the basement. 80 pairs of lungs breathing 80 hearts, beating 80 people who had been strangers 5 minutes ago, now pressed together in a space meant for maybe 30. Eleanor fumbled for the flashlight she kept taped to the support beam by the stairs. Her hands were shaking badly now, adrenaline and Parkinson's combining into a symphony of tremors, but she managed to click it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing faces. So many faces, young and old, male and female, all wearing the same expression of barely controlled terror. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "This is my home. That storm up there doesn't care who any of us are. Down here, we're all just people trying to survive." "Understood." A few nods. A murmured "yes, ma'am" from somewhere in the back. Marcus's voice firm. "Understood." "Good." Eleanor swept the flashlight across the basement, taking stock. Shelves of canned goods, old blankets, a folding table, a battery-powered radio. The essentials Robert had insisted on keeping down here. Find a spot on the floor back against the walls if you can. If you're bleeding, tell me now. If you need water, we have some. They moved settling into the available space with practiced efficiency. These weren't people unfamiliar with danger, Eleanor realized. They knew how to hunker down, how to make themselves small, how to wait out threats. It was almost military in its precision. Marcus ended up near Eleanor, his back against the wall next to the stairs. Even sitting, he was tall, imposing. The patch on his leather vest caught the flashlight beam. Hell's Angels Oklahoma chapter. Beneath it, a collection of other patches she didn't recognize, symbols and abbreviations that meant something in a world she'd never been part of. Thank you, he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear over the increasing roar above them. For this, for not slamming the door in our faces. Eleanor looked at him, really looked, past the leather and the patches and the reputation to the man underneath. She saw exhaustion there and something else. Resignation, maybe, or acceptance. The look of someone who'd been running for a long time and was tired of it. How old is that kid, she asked, nodding toward the young man with the wide eyes who'd whispered his thanks. Marcus followed her gaze. Dylan, 19, just turned last month. He with you by choice. Marcus's expression tightened. We're getting him somewhere safe, away from people who want to hurt him. Gang trouble. Something like that. Eleanor nodded slowly. My grandson was 19 when he died. Overdose. I always wondered if someone had been there, if someone had tried to get him somewhere safe. She trailed off the old pain, rising up unexpected and sharp. Marcus didn't offer empty condolences, which she appreciated. He just said, I'm sorry. Above them, the roar was building. No longer a sound, but a presence, a physical force that made the walls vibrate and dust rain from the ceiling beams. Someone in the basement whimpered. Someone else started praying, words running together too fast to distinguish. Eleanor reached for the radio, cranked the handle to charge it, and clicked it on. Static hissed, then a thin voice broke through tornado on the ground. Multiple reports of damage. Take shelter immediately. This is not a drill. The signal died in a burst of static. Eleanor clicked the radio off and set it aside. They didn't need weather reports now. They needed luck. The young kid Dylan was breathing too fast, each inhale sharp and panicked. Marcus noticed at the same time Eleanor did. He reached across the darkness and grabbed Dylan's shoulder. Hey, Marcus, said voice firm but not harsh. Look at me. Breathe with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Come on. Dylan failed, tried again. His breathing evened out slightly, but Eleanor could see he was still on the edge of breaking. Tell me about your first bike, Eleanor said suddenly. Dylan's head turned toward her, confusion cutting through panic. What? Your first bike, what was it? A Yamaha. Used. Piece of junk really, but it was mine. His voice was shaking but steadying. And why did you want it? Freedom, I guess. Feeling like I could go anywhere. A ghost of a smile. Stupid, probably. Not stupid, Eleanor said. I felt the same way about this house when Robert and I bought it. Felt like we could do anything as long as we had it. Turned out the house owned us more than we owned it, but that's marriage for you. A few people laughed, brief and startled. The tension in the basement eased a fraction. And then the tornado hit. The sound was beyond description, beyond hearing, really. It was pressure and force and rage made audible, a freight train multiplied by 1,000 and fed through a meat grinder. The entire basement shook. The walls 3 feet of reinforced concrete that Robert had insisted on flexed inward with an audible groan. Something above them on the ground level shattered with a sound like 1,000 windows breaking at once. Then another sound longer and more terrible, the slow, tortured scream of the house being torn apart. Eleanor clutched the flashlight like a lifeline and tried not to think about 49 years of memories being scattered across 3 counties. She tried not to think about Robert's chair by the window, the quilt her mother had made, the photo albums in the hall closet. She tried not to think about anything except breathing and counting and praying that the ceiling above them would hold. The tornado seemed to last forever. Time lost meaning in the dark, stretched and compressed until Eleanor couldn't tell if they'd been down there for seconds or hours. All that existed was the roar and the shaking and the taste of dirt in the air. And then gradually, impossibly, the sound began to change. The freight train started pulling away. The pressure eased. The walls stopped groaning. The violence overhead became chaos, then simply noise, then something approaching normal. Eleanor waited. You didn't trust tornado silence. It liked to trick you, like to make you think it was over, so you'd come out and then it would circle back for a second helping. She forced herself to count to 300 slow and steady before she spoke. "Everyone okay?" she called out. "Sound off if you're hurt." A chorus of voices came back, shaky but whole. No one was seriously injured, though a few people had bumps and bruises from being thrown against the walls. Minor miracles in a night full of them. Marcus stood slowly, joints popping in the dark. "Stay here," he told his people. "Let me check it out first." He climbed the stairs with Eleanor following, ignoring his protest. It was her house, or what was left of it. She had a right to see. The storm door was jammed, debris piled against it from outside. It took both of them, pushing Marcus's considerable strength and Eleanor's stubborn determination, to shift it enough to squeeze through. And when they did, when they climbed up into what had been her yard and looked around at the devastation, Eleanor felt something inside her crack open. The house was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, gone. Where her home had stood 5 minutes ago, there was nothing but a foundation and scattered lumber. The walls had been peeled away like paper. The roof was completely absent, probably decorating someone else's property by now. Her furniture, her belongings, her life, all of it was just gone. She stood there, breathing hard, trying to process the absoluteness of the destruction. Behind her, she could hear the others starting to emerge from the basement, their voices rising in shock and dismay as they saw what the tornado had done. The wheat fields were flattened, bent, and broken like crushed grass. Her barn had collapsed entirely, just a pile of twisted metal and splintered wood. Trees that had stood for generations were lying on their sides, root balls exposed to the sky like open wounds. And in the middle of it all, on what used to be her front porch, sat a single object that the storm had somehow seen fit to spare. Robert's toolbox, battered, but intact, its red paint gleaming in the gray afternoon light. Eleanor walked over to it on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She knelt down, her knees protesting, and opened the lid. Inside, everything was exactly where Robert had left it 3 years ago. Hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches, all organized with the precision of a man who believed in putting things in their proper place. And underneath the top tray, tucked in where she'd never thought to look, was an envelope. Her name was written on it in Robert's careful handwriting. "Eleanor, read this when you survive what I couldn't stop." Her hands started shaking again as she picked it up. Around her, the members of Hell's Angels were checking on each other, taking stock of injuries and lost equipment. Marcus was on his phone trying to get a signal. Dylan was sitting on a piece of foundation, staring at the destruction with the blank expression of someone whose brain had temporarily given up on processing reality. Eleanor opened the envelope. The letter inside was short, just a single page, but every word felt like Robert reaching through time to grab her by the shoulders. "Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're still here. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I won't be there to help you through whatever comes next, but I need you to know something. The tornado sirens in this county haven't been maintained in 3 years. I know, because I tried to get the council to allocate funds and was shut down every time. There's a company, Brennan Development, that's been buying up disaster-damaged property for pennies on the dollar. They have connections in the county government. Sheriff Blackwood specifically. I started digging into it last year when the Petersons lost their farm after that hailstorm. Something wasn't right about how fast they were pressured to sell, about how the insurance claims got complicated. I think I was right. I think there's a pattern, and I think someone noticed I was asking questions. My heart, Ellie. The doctor says it's just age, just stress, just bad luck. But my medications changed 3 months ago. New pharmacy, new pills in old bottles. I can't prove anything, but I know what's happening to me isn't natural. If something happens, if they come for the house after I'm gone, fight them. Not because the house matters, not because you need to win some argument we had about where to live. Fight them because they killed me and they can't be allowed to keep doing this to people. I've been collecting evidence. It's all in the safe in the barn combination your birth year. Financial records, emails, I intercepted maintenance logs for the sirens. Everything you'll need. I love you, Ellie. I'm sorry I won't be there to stand with you, but you've always been stronger than you know. Stronger than I ever was. Don't let them take what's yours. Robert. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before the words really penetrated. Robert had known. He'd known, and he'd tried to protect her by dying with his secrets intact, but he'd also left her the tools to fight back. Murdered. Her husband had been murdered slowly and carefully by people who wanted his investigation to go away. And the barn where he'd hidden the evidence was now a pile of rubble. She stood up, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into her pocket. Her hands had stopped shaking. The tremor from the Parkinson's was still there, would always be there, but the fear shake was gone, replaced by something colder and harder. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "Ma'am, you should sit down. I look like someone whose house just got destroyed by a tornado that no one warned us about," Eleanor said flatly. "Help me search that barn debris. We're looking for a safe." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Eleanor pulled out Robert's letter and handed it to him. "Because someone murdered my husband and used a tornado to cover their tracks. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let them get away with it." Marcus read the letter in silence. When he looked up, his expression had changed. No longer just sympathetic, but calculating. The look of a tactician assessing a battlefield. "You're talking about going to war with the sheriff and a development company," he said carefully. "That's not a small thing." "I'm talking about justice," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference." "Not in practice, there isn't." But Marcus was already moving toward the barn wreckage, already gesturing for others to join him. "You heard the lady. We're looking for a safe, small, probably fireproof. Could be buried in this mess anywhere." They searched as the afternoon light faded toward evening. It took 40 minutes and a dozen scraped hands before Dylan shouted from the far side of the debris pile. "Found something." The safe was battered but intact, wedged under a support beam that had probably saved it from being carried off with the rest of the barn. Eleanor knelt beside it and spun the combination lock with fingers that suddenly felt steady. Her birth year, 1950. It clicked open. Inside were 3 flash drives, a stack of papers, and another envelope marked, "For attorney, do not open." Eleanor stared at the contents for a long moment, then looked up at Marcus and the others who had gathered around. "I need help," she said simply. "I need protection while I figure out what to do with this. I need witnesses. I need—" She trailed off, not sure exactly what she needed, except that she couldn't do this alone. Marcus crouched down beside her, his knees popping. "You saved 79 lives today. We don't forget that. Hell's Angels pay their debts." "This isn't about debts," Eleanor said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It's about what's right. But the debt is real anyway. You need help, you've got it. Whatever you're planning, we're in." Dylan stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "They killed your husband. They almost killed all of us by shutting down those sirens. Someone needs to answer for that." Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her, these strangers who an hour ago had been nothing more than a reputation and a patch. They were watching her with something that looked almost like loyalty, or maybe just the recognition of a shared enemy. "Okay," she said, getting to her feet with Marcus's help. "Then here's what we're going to do." But before she could continue, headlights appeared at the end of her driveway, cutting through the gathering dark. A vehicle moving slow and deliberate. As it got closer, Eleanor could make out the light bar on top and the shield on the door. "Sheriff's Department." "Well," Marcus said quietly, his hand moving toward his belt, where Eleanor noticed for the first time he was carrying. "That didn't take long." Eleanor put her hand on his arm. "No, not like that. Let me handle this." "Ma'am, my house, my fight. You all stay visible but calm. Record everything if you can. And if something happens to me, get that safe to a lawyer. Any lawyer not from this county." She walked forward to meet the vehicle, her boots crunching on broken glass and scattered insulation. The patrol car stopped 10 feet from her engine idling, and a man stepped out. Sheriff Warren Blackwood was a big man running slightly to fat, in the way of people who'd once been powerful and were still trading on the memory. His uniform was crisp despite the disaster around them, his boots clean, like he'd avoided walking through anything messy. He looked at Eleanor with an expression of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, voice smooth as oil, "I heard you had some unexpected guests during the storm. Just wanted to check that everything's all right." Eleanor looked past him at the destroyed house, the flattened fields, the 79 motorcycle riders watching from various positions around the property. "Everything's fine," she said. "Thanks for checking." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's quite a crowd you've got here. Must be frightening being surrounded by." He paused, letting the implication hang. "Strangers." "They're not strangers," Eleanor said. "They're the people I saved from a tornado that your sirens didn't warn us about." "Yes, about that." Blackwood pulled out a notepad, making a show of consulting it. "We've been having technical difficulties with the warning system. Storm damage most likely. I'm sure you understand these things happen." "I'm sure they do," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. Just like I'm sure you'll be investigating why a system that was supposedly working fine yesterday suddenly failed right before the biggest tornado to hit this county in a decade. Blackwood's smile hardened. Mrs. Hayes, I understand you're upset. You've lost your home, you're in shock. Maybe it would be best if you came into town, let us find you somewhere safe to stay. Somewhere calm. I am somewhere safe, Eleanor said. This is my property, I'm staying on it. With them, Blackwood gestured at the bikers. Mrs. Hayes, I don't think you understand what kind of people these are. I understand exactly what kind of people they are, Eleanor said. They're the kind who helped me search my property for something important. They're the kind who are making sure I'm not alone right now. What kind of person does that make you? Sheriff showing up after the dangers passed to ask questions. The mask slipped for just a second, and Eleanor saw something cold and calculating behind Blackwood's official concern. Then it was back the sympathetic authority figure dealing with a traumatized old woman. Well, if you insist on staying, I'll need to take down some information for insurance purposes. You do still have insurance, don't you? I do, Eleanor said firmly, even though a small voice in her head whispered that she should check, should call and confirm, should make sure everything was actually in order. Good, good. Well, I'll leave you to it then. Blackwood started to turn back to his vehicle, then stopped as if just remembering something. Oh, one more thing. I'll need names and identification from all your guests. Just routine, you understand. Need to make sure everyone who was on the property during the disaster is accounted for. No, Eleanor said. Blackwood turned back slowly. I'm sorry. I said no. This is private property. These people are my guests. Unless you have warrants or probable cause, you have no right to demand their information. The sheriff's expression went flat. Mrs. Hayes, I'm trying to help you, but if you're going to be difficult— I'm not being difficult, Eleanor interrupted. I'm being precise. And unless you have official business as sheriff, I'd appreciate it if you left my property. I have a lot of cleaning up to do. For a long moment, Blackwood just stared at her. The pretense of sympathy was completely gone, now replaced by something harder. When he spoke, his voice was soft and cold. You should be very careful, Mrs. Hayes. This county has rules about emergency housing, about condemned properties, about unsafe structures. It would be a shame if you found yourself declared unfit to make your own decisions. Happens sometimes with elderly folks after trauma. For their own protection, you understand. Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. Was that a threat, Sheriff? That was advice, Blackwood said. Take it or leave it. He got back in his vehicle and drove away, tires crunching over debris. Eleanor watched until the taillights disappeared, then turned to find Marcus at her shoulder. Well, he said, that was subtle. He's going to move against me, Eleanor said quietly. Probably soon. He knows I have Robert's evidence or suspects it anyway. He can't let me make it public. Then we move first, Marcus said. Get the evidence to someone who can use it. A lawyer, a journalist, someone with reach. Eleanor shook her head. Not yet. He'll be expecting that. He'll have people watching for it. So what do we do? Eleanor looked around at her destroyed home, at the people who'd sheltered in her basement, at the safe full of secrets that could bring down a corrupt sheriff and the company that had murdered her husband. We make them think I'm just a scared old woman, she said. We let them feel confident. And while they're feeling confident, we build a case they can't ignore. Marcus studied her face in the dying light. You know this could get people killed, right? Not just you, all of us. I know, Eleanor said. Which is why I'm giving everyone a choice right now. You saved your own lives in my basement. You don't owe me anything beyond that. If you want to leave, leave. I won't think less of you for it. No one moved. Dylan spoke up from the debris pile where he was still sitting. They shut off the sirens on purpose. Let people die to make money off the disaster. He struggled for words. That's evil. Yes, Eleanor agreed. It is. Then we stay, Dylan said, and around him others nodded. Marcus put his hand out, and Eleanor shook it, the gesture formal and binding. All right then, she said. First things first. We need power, water, and shelter. Can you help with that? Already on it, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. I've got people who can get us generator supplies, everything we need to set up a camp on your property. If you'll have us, I'll have you, Eleanor said. As night fell completely, as the temperature dropped, and the reality of what she'd lost started to settle in, Eleanor sat on the foundation of her destroyed home and held Robert's letter in her hands. Around her, the members of Hell's Angels were already organizing, making calls, setting up temporary shelter. Someone found a tarp and strung it up. Someone else started a fire in a barrel. Small acts of civilization being rebuilt from chaos. And Eleanor, 76 years old with Parkinson's, starting to claim her hands and grief still fresh in her chest, made a decision. She wasn't going to just fight, she was going to win. For Robert, for these strangers who'd become allies, for every person who'd been crushed by systems that valued money over lives. The storm had taken her house, but it hadn't taken her. And that she thought was going to prove to be Sheriff Blackwood's biggest mistake. The first night was the hardest, not because of discomfort, but because of silence. Eleanor had grown accustomed to silence over the 3 years since Robert died, but this was different. This was the silence of absence of everything she'd known being stripped away by wind and violence. She sat in a camping chair someone had produced from nowhere, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like motor oil and leather, watching shadows move around the makeshift camp. The Hells Angels had transformed her property into something functional with startling efficiency. Generators hummed. A cooking station had materialized, producing coffee that tasted like salvation. People moved with purpose, checking on each other, organizing supplies, making calls to people Eleanor would never meet, but whose help was apparently guaranteed. Marcus sat down beside her with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one. Can't sleep. Don't want to, Eleanor admitted. Feels like if I close my eyes, I'll wake up and find out the last 3 years were a dream. That Robert's still alive, still arguing with me about selling this place. Would that be good or bad? Eleanor considered. Both. I'd get him back, but I'd also know I was going to lose him again. Not sure which is worse. They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee that was too hot and too bitter, but exactly what the moment needed. Around them, the camp was settling into the rhythms of night watch. Marcus's people rotated shifts without being told, a military precision that spoke to training and experience. How many of your people are veterans? Eleanor asked. Most. Hells Angels has always had a strong military connection. Marines mostly, but all branches. Marcus stared into his coffee. We understand certain things about loyalty and brotherhood that civilians sometimes don't. And we understand what it's like to be judged by how we look rather than who we are. The sheriff thinks you're criminals. Some angels are, won't lie about that. But this chapter, Marcus gestured around. We're veterans trying to figure out what peace looks like. We ride together, we watch each other's backs. We have rules and structure because that's what kept us alive overseas. Doesn't always translate well to civilian life. Dylan, Eleanor said, he's not a veteran. Marcus's expression tightened. No, Dylan's something else. A mistake we're trying to correct before it's permanent. What kind of mistake? Marcus was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then Dylan grew up in Tulsa. Bad neighborhood, worse family situation. Father in prison, mother on drugs. He fell in with a local gang, Los Diablos, when he was 16. Did some things he's not proud of. Hurt people. Eleanor's chest tightened. She thought of her grandson, the bright boy, who'd become a stranger, who died with a needle in his arm in a motel room in Oklahoma City. About 6 months ago, Marcus continued. Dylan decided he wanted out. Gangs don't like that. They especially don't like it when you know things that could send people to prison. Dylan came to us because his father was an angel before he got locked up, asked for protection, and you gave it. We're trying to. But Los Diablos has a long reach. That's why we were moving Dylan when the tornado hit, taking him to a chapter in Colorado where he could disappear for a while. He has a warrant, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked at her sharply. How'd you know? The way he flinched when the sheriff showed up. The way he keeps looking over his shoulder. He's wanted for something. Assault. Bar fight in Texas 2 years ago. Kid he hit ended up with a broken jaw and a concussion. Dylan was 19, drunk, stupid. The other guy pulled a knife first, but Dylan didn't stick around to tell his side. Just ran. Will they come for him? Probably. Sheriff Blackwood strikes me as the type to use any leverage he can find. Eleanor thought about that, about the layers of vulnerability stacking up. She had evidence against a corrupt sheriff. She was harboring someone with a warrant. She was 76 years old with Parkinson's disease and no home. On paper, she looked like the perfect victim. Good, she said. Marcus frowned. Good. He'll underestimate me. They always do. Old woman alone scared. He'll think I'll break easily. And you won't. Eleanor smiled without humor. Marcus, I taught high school English for 40 years. I've dealt with teenage girls who thought they could destroy me with rumors and teenage boys who thought physical intimidation was an argument. I once had a parent threaten to sue me because I failed their son for plagiarism. I've been underestimated my entire life. She took another sip of terrible coffee. Sheriff Blackwood is about to learn that's a mistake. The next morning brought complications in the form of a white news van pulling onto her property. Eleanor was helping Dylan organize supply crates when she saw the bright logo on the side announcing Channel 4 News from Oklahoma City. Shit, Dylan muttered, already moving toward the shadows. No, Eleanor said, catching his arm. Stay visible. Look helpful. Look normal. But the warrant is from Texas, not Oklahoma. If the sheriff wanted you arrested, he'd have done it yesterday. This is surveillance, not enforcement. She squeezed his arm. Trust me. A woman emerged from the van, late 30s, sharp suit, somehow surviving the rural setting, followed by a cameraman who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The reporter spotted Eleanor and headed over with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Hayes, I'm Jennifer Marks, Channel 4 News. I heard about what happened here during the tornado. Is it true you sheltered dozens of people in your basement? Eleanor glanced at Marcus, who had appeared at her elbow. He shook his head slightly. Don't give them anything. But Eleanor had a different idea. 79 people, she said clearly. The tornado warning sirens didn't go off. These folks would have died on the highway if there'd been nowhere to shelter. Jennifer's eyes lit up with the scent of a story. The sirens didn't activate. That's a serious failure. Yes, Eleanor agreed. Very serious. Can we get footage of the damage? Maybe an interview. Eleanor considered. A news crew meant witnesses, documentation, public attention. All things that would make it harder for Sheriff Blackwood to make her quietly disappear. On one condition, Eleanor said, you report the full story. The tornado damage, yes, but also the siren failure. The questions that need to be asked about why a county warning system failed during the biggest storm of the season. Jennifer smiled. We can do that. The interview took 20 minutes. Eleanor stood in front of the destroyed house foundation and talked about hearing no warning, about seeing the tornado bearing down, about making the choice to open her shelter to strangers. She was careful, precise, giving facts without speculation. And these people, Jennifer gestured at the Hells Angels moving around the property, they're still here. They're helping me, Eleanor said simply. I lost my home. They're making sure I'm not alone while I figure out next steps. Some people might find it unusual, a woman of your age housing a motorcycle club. Eleanor looked directly at the camera. Some people might find it unusual that tornado sirens don't work. I think we should focus on the unusual things that kill people, not the unusual things that save them. Jennifer Marks smiled, a real smile, this time not the professional mask. Good answer. After the news crew left, Marcus pulled Eleanor aside. That was smart. Public attention makes it harder for them to move against you quietly. That's the idea, but it also starts the clock. Blackwood will know I'm not just going to curl up and disappear. So what's our next move? Eleanor looked toward the barn debris where the safe still sat hidden under a tarp. We need to know exactly what Robert found, all of it. And we need someone who can interpret it, make sense of the financial records and emails. I know a guy, Marcus said, former military intelligence, works as a private investigator now. Owes me a favor. Is he trustworthy? With his life. Mine too, if it comes to that. Eleanor nodded. Call him, but carefully. I don't know how far Blackwood's reach extends. The investigator arrived that afternoon, a lean man in his 50s named James Reeves, who looked at the motorcycle camp without visible reaction. Marcus introduced him to Eleanor, and they spread the contents of Robert's safe across a folding table under the tarp. 3 flash drives, 17 pages of printed emails, a ledger of financial transactions, and the sealed envelope marked for attorney. Don't open that one yet, James advised, examining the envelope. Once it's opened, you can't claim attorney-client privilege if it contains communication Robert had with a lawyer. Keep it sealed until you're ready to hand it directly to legal counsel. He spent 2 hours going through the flash drives on a laptop, his expression growing progressively darker. Finally, he sat back and looked at Eleanor. Your husband was thorough, and he was right. Tell me. James pulled up a spreadsheet. This is a record of property sales in this county over the last 5 years. Robert tracked every sale that happened within 6 months of a natural disaster. Storm damage, tornado, flooding. The pattern is clear. He pointed at highlighted rows. A disaster hits. Insurance companies suddenly find reasons to delay or deny claims. The county building inspector, that's Frank Morrison, by the way, issues condemnation notices for structural damage. Property owners find themselves underwater, financially speaking. No insurance payout, home, condemned, nowhere to live. And then Brennan Development swoops in, Eleanor said. Exactly. Offering cash, quick close, solving all their problems. Except the price is usually 30 to 40% below market value. Sometimes more. That's disaster capitalism. That's fraud, James corrected. Because Brennan Development has a silent partner. He pulled up another file, shell company registered in Delaware. But if you follow the ownership chain far enough, he traced it with his finger on the screen. Sheriff Warren Blackwood and his brother owned 30% of Brennan Development through this shell company. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. So Blackwood profits every time someone loses their property after a disaster. More than that, look at this. James opened an email chain. These are communications between Brennan, that's Victor, Brennan, the CEO, and County Maintenance Supervisor Phil Hartley. They're discussing the tornado warning system. Eleanor leaned in reading. The emails were coded careful, but the implication was clear. Maintenance on the siren system had been deliberately delayed, parts orders canceled, routine tests skipped. They wanted it to fail, she said, voice hollow. They wanted the next major tornado to catch people unprepared. James agreed. More damage means more vulnerable property owners, means more opportunities to buy cheap. That's murder. People died. 7 confirmed deaths from yesterday's tornado, James said quietly. Probably more once they finish searching. Yes, Mrs. Hayes, it's murder. Eleanor sat down heavily. Robert had known. He'd figured it out, documented it, and they'd killed him for it. The pharmacy records, she said. Robert mentioned his medications changed. James pulled up another file. Your husband had prescriptions at Hartley's pharmacy. That's Phil Hartley's brother's business. 3 months before he died, there's a note in the pharmacy logs about substituting generic medications due to insurance changes. But Robert had the same insurance. Exactly. Someone changed his prescriptions. Probably added something to his heart medication, something that would accelerate his condition without being obvious. Eleanor closed her eyes. She'd held Robert's hand while he died, watched him slip away over weeks of declining health, and all the while he'd known. He'd known he was being murdered and said nothing to protect her. Bastards, she whispered. Yeah, James agreed. Professional bastards, too. This is organized, methodical. They've been running this operation for years. Can we prove it in court? James hesitated. The financial connection between Blackwood and Brennan, yes. The deliberately failed siren system, probably. The manipulation of property sales, definitely. Robert's murder. He shook his head. That's going to be harder. Circumstantial at best. But combined with everything else, it builds a picture. What do we need to make it stick? More witnesses. People willing to testify about the pressure they felt, the suspicious timing of their insurance problems, the lowball offers from Brennan. And ideally, someone from inside the operation willing to turn. Eleanor thought about that. Then she thought about the news van, the public attention, the way Blackwood had looked at her with barely concealed malice. He's going to move against me soon, she said. Try to discredit me, make me look incompetent or unstable. Almost certainly, James agreed. Good. Let him try. Every move he makes is more evidence of corruption. Marcus had been listening quietly. Now he spoke up. Eleanor, you're talking about using yourself as bait. That's dangerous. I'm 76 years old with a disease that's going to take my independence eventually anyway, Eleanor said. If I'm going to go down, I'd rather go down fighting than fading. That's not... Marcus, Eleanor looked at him steadily. I appreciate your concern, but this is my choice. They killed my husband. They let people die yesterday for profit. I have evidence that can stop them. What would you do in my position? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Same thing, but I'd make damn sure I had backup. That's why you're here. Over the next 3 days, a pattern developed. Eleanor would make public appearances at the temporary FEMA station, set up in town at community meetings, about disaster relief at the hardware store buying supplies. Each time she was careful to be visible, to mention the siren failure, to ask pointed questions about building inspections and insurance procedures. And each time she felt the weight of attention. Not friendly attention, surveillance. Deputy Kyle Foster seemed to be everywhere she went, always just in view, always with his phone out. Sometimes obviously filming her, sometimes pretending not to. It was psychological pressure, the visible reminder that she was being watched. The third day, she went to the county office to file for building permits and emergency assistance. The clerk behind the desk, a tired woman named Brenda, looked uncomfortable the moment Eleanor walked in. Mrs. Hayes, I heard about your property. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Brenda. I need to file for reconstruction permits and see about my insurance claim status. Brenda's discomfort increased. About that, there seems to be an issue with your insurance policy. Eleanor's stomach dropped even though she'd been expecting this. What kind of issue? The system shows your homeowner's policy lapsed 6 months ago. That's not possible. I've been paying it. I know it seems that way, but Brenda turned her computer monitor so Eleanor could see. The screen showed Eleanor's policy with a clear notation, lapsed non-payment. This is wrong, Eleanor said firmly. I have bank statements showing the payments went through. Then you'll need to take that up with the insurance company directly. But until it's resolved, you're not covered for the tornado damage. Eleanor pulled out her phone, opened her banking app with shaking fingers, and pulled up 6 months of automatic payments to her insurance company. She turned the screen to show Brenda. There, every month, paid in full. Brenda looked genuinely distressed now. I don't know what to tell you, Mrs. Hayes. The system shows what it shows. The system is wrong. Maybe so, but I can't override it. You'll need to file a dispute. How long does a dispute take? Brenda hesitated. In a normal situation, few weeks, maybe a month. But with the tornado, the insurance company is overwhelmed. Could be several months. And in the meantime, I can't get any assistance because the county requires proof of insurance before approving emergency housing funds. I'm sorry, those are the rules. Eleanor looked at Brenda's face and saw genuine sympathy there, but also resignation. This woman knew something was wrong, but she wasn't going to stick her neck out to fix it. Is there anyone else I can talk to? A supervisor? Mr. Morrison is the building inspector. He handles all disaster claims. Frank Morrison, the same man James Reeves had identified as part of Blackwood's network. Perfect, Eleanor said with false cheer. I'll speak with him. Morrison's office was down the hall, and his secretary, young nervous, clearly told what to do, made Eleanor wait 45 minutes before allowing her inside. Frank Morrison was a small man with a large opinion of himself, the kind who compensated for physical insignificance with bureaucratic power. He looked up from his desk as Eleanor entered, and his expression managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and dismissive. Mrs. Hayes, terrible business with the tornado. I understand you lost everything. My house, Eleanor corrected. Not everything. Not yet. Morrison's smile thinned. Yes, well, I've actually been meaning to schedule an inspection of your property. Routine procedure after major structural damage. The structure is gone. There's nothing to inspect. The foundation, the basement, and the land itself. Need to make sure it's safe for habitation. Can't have you living in dangerous conditions. I'm living in a tent on my own property. Yes, and that's another concern. County regulations prohibit permanent camping on residential land without proper permits. Eleanor felt anger rising but kept her voice level. Then I'll apply for a permit. I'm afraid those permits require proof of insurance and a valid building plan. Which brings us back to your insurance issue. My insurance is valid. The records are wrong. Morrison spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness that was entirely performative. That's between you and your insurance company. My hands are tied until it's resolved. How convenient. Morrison's expression hardened. Mrs. Hayes, I'm trying to help you, but you seem determined to be difficult. Now I have options we could discuss. Emergency relocation assistance, for instance. The county has authorized temporary housing vouchers for disaster victims. Temporary housing, where there's a very nice assisted living facility in Oklahoma City. Clean, comfortable, fully staffed. You'd be well taken care of while you sort out your situation. There it was, the trap baited with compassion and concern. I'm not interested in assisted living, Eleanor said. I'm staying on my property. That may not be possible. If I determine the land is unsafe, then I'll appeal your determination, and I'll bring my own engineer's report, and I'll file complaints with every state agency that oversees building inspections. Eleanor leaned forward. And I'll make sure the media knows that the county is trying to force a 76-year-old tornado survivor off her own land. Morrison's face flushed. That's not what's happening here. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks an awful lot like you're manufacturing reasons to declare my property uninhabitable, so I'm forced to sell. That's a serious accusation. Yes, it is. I'm glad we agree on that. They stared at each other across the desk, the pretense of civility completely abandoned. Finally, Morrison said, I'll be conducting my inspection tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. I strongly suggest you cooperate. Oh, I'll cooperate, Eleanor said, standing. And I'll make sure there are plenty of witnesses present for transparency. She walked out before he could respond, her heart hammering, hands shaking badly enough that she had to shove them in her pockets. Behind her, she heard Morrison pick up his phone, voice low and urgent, making calls, reporting. Good. Let him report. Let them all know she wasn't going to be quietly bulldozed. Outside the county building, she found Deputy Foster leaning against his patrol car, phone pointed at her. Always filming. Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes, he said with false pleasantness. Having a productive day. Very, Eleanor replied. You. Just keeping an eye on things. Making sure everyone stays safe. How public-spirited of you. Foster's smile hardened. You know, Mrs. Hayes, people are talking, wondering why you're still hosting that motorcycle club on your property. Some folks find it concerning. I'm sure some folks find lots of things concerning. Probably concerned about the tornado sirens failing too, don't you think? Foster's expression went flat. The siren system failed due to storm damage. These things happen. Before the storm hit, lightning strike most likely took out the control systems. That's an interesting theory. I'm sure the state investigators will want to examine it closely. There are no state investigators. Not yet, Eleanor agreed, but I've filed formal complaints with the State Department of Emergency Management and the Oklahoma Insurance Commissioner. So there will be. Foster pushed off from his car, anger breaking through the professional mask. You're making things very difficult for yourself, Mrs. Hayes. People are trying to help you and you keep fighting them. If you wanted to help me, you'd be investigating why the sirens failed instead of following me around with a camera. I'm documenting. You're building a case, Eleanor interrupted. Collecting footage to make me look unstable, confused, maybe dangerous. So when Sheriff Blackwood makes his move, whatever that move is, you'll have plenty of evidence that it was necessary. Foster's jaw tightened. You sound paranoid. I sound informed. There's a difference. She walked past him toward where Marcus was waiting in an old pickup truck they'd borrowed from somewhere. Foster called after her, voice hard. You should be careful, Mrs. Hayes. Paranoia can be a symptom of declining mental health, especially in elderly people after trauma. Eleanor stopped, turned back. Are you threatening me, Deputy? I'm expressing concern for your safety. My safety would be better served by law enforcement doing their actual job instead of harassing tornado survivors. She got in the truck and Marcus pulled away. In the side mirror, she could see Foster on his phone again, animated, angry. They're closing in, Marcus observed. Yes, tomorrow Morrison's going to inspect my property. He'll find it unsafe, try to condemn it. We won't let that happen. You might not have a choice. He has the authority. Then we make noise, call the news, get witnesses. Eleanor nodded slowly. And we need to be ready for them to escalate. They've tried isolation, they've tried bureaucratic pressure. Next comes something more direct. Like what? Like using Dylan's warrant. Like arresting people on my property to scatter everyone. Like, she trailed off thinking, like making me seem dangerous. If I'm harboring criminals, if I'm unstable, if I'm a threat to community safety, then forcing me into assisted living starts to look reasonable. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. We should get Dylan out, send him to Colorado like we planned. No, if Dylan runs now, it confirms their narrative. We need him visible, cooperative, normal. He's not a dangerous gang member. He's a kid helping a tornado victim rebuild. That's the story. Eleanor, if they arrest him, we make sure it's public documented and obviously retaliatory. Everything they do to hurt us becomes evidence against them. They drove in silence for a while. Then Marcus said quietly, you know this might not work, right? You're one woman against a corrupt sheriff, a development company with resources, and a county government that's either compromised or complicit. The odds aren't good. The odds have never been good, Eleanor replied. That's not the point. What is the point? Eleanor thought about Robert's letter, about his handwriting those words, knowing he was dying, knowing he was leaving her to fight a battle he couldn't finish. She thought about the 7 people who died in the tornado, while sirens that should have warned them stayed silent. She thought about Dylan, 19 years old and trying desperately to escape a violent past. The point is that someone has to try, she said. Someone has to stand up and say, no, this isn't right. This isn't acceptable. You can't just hurt people for profit. Maybe I fail. Maybe they crush me. But at least I tried. Marcus nodded slowly. You remind me of my mother. She had that same stubborn idealism. Is that a compliment? She died trying to evacuate civilians in Fallujah. Refused to leave when the shooting started because there were kids still in the building. Marcus's voice was rough. So yeah, it's a compliment, but it's also a warning. Eleanor reached over and squeezed his arm. I hear you, and I'm grateful, Marcus, for all of this. But I'm not backing down. Didn't expect you would. They arrived back at the property to find chaos. Several patrol cars were parked along the road, lights flashing. Deputies were moving through the camp, checking bikes, questioning people. And in the middle of it all, Sheriff Blackwood stood with his arms crossed, watching like a general surveying his troops. Eleanor got out of the truck and walked toward him, Marcus a half step behind. Sheriff, she said, coldly, can I help you? Blackwood smiled. Just a routine inspection, Mrs. Hayes, making sure everyone on your property is here legally. This is private property. You don't have jurisdiction without cause. I have cause. We received reports of suspicious activity, possible drug trafficking. That's absurd. Is it you're housing dozens of members of a known motorcycle gang? Forgive me if I take drug reports seriously. You won't find any drugs here, Marcus said evenly. Blackwood's smile widened. We'll see about that. And in that moment, Eleanor knew. They'd planted something. This wasn't a fishing expedition, it was a setup. I want everything documented, she said loudly, pulling out her phone. Every search, every action. I'm recording this. You're welcome to, Blackwood said. We have nothing to hide. The search took 2 hours. Deputies went through every tent, every bike, every piece of equipment, and Eleanor watched filming, documenting, while her heart hammered with dread. Finally, a deputy emerged from Dylan's tent holding a plastic bag. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see what was inside. Pills. Lots of them. Well, well, Blackwood said. Looks like we found something after all. Dylan's face went white. That's not mine. I don't... Save it for booking. Blackwood nodded to his deputies. Cuff him. No. Marcus stepped forward. Those were planted. Dylan doesn't use. Then he won't mind taking a drug test at the station. Blackwood's smile was triumphant now, along with fingerprint analysis on the bag, documentation of where it was found, all proper procedure. This is harassment, Eleanor said, still filming. This is law enforcement. You want to be careful, Mrs. Hayes. Harboring a known criminal with drugs on your property, that could make you an accessory. Dylan has never been convicted of anything. He has a warrant for assault in Texas. Blackwood pulled out a printed form. We ran everyone's names through the system. Interesting what came up. Dylan was trembling now, hands cuffed behind his back, looking younger than 19. Looking terrified. I didn't do anything, he said. I didn't. Son, you've got a warrant and drugs in your tent. That's something. Blackwood gestured to his deputies. Take him in, and I want full searches of every vehicle and structure on this property. You need a warrant for that, Marcus said. I have probable cause. Drugs were found. That gives me authority to search everything connected. They took Dylan away in the back of a patrol car, and then the real search began. Aggressive, invasive, designed to humiliate and scatter. Bikes were torn apart. Tents were ripped open. Personal belongings were dumped in the dirt. And through it all, Blackwood watched Eleanor with barely concealed satisfaction. This was his message. I can take everything from you. Your home, your allies, your dignity. And there's nothing you can do about it. Eleanor filmed it all, hands shaking so badly the footage would be almost unusable. But she filmed it anyway because that was all she had. When they finally left the camp, looked like it had been hit by a second tornado. People stood among their scattered belongings, angry and shaken. Marcus came to Eleanor, his face dark with rage. They planted those drugs. Dylan's clean has been for 2 years. I know. We need to get him out. We need a lawyer, Eleanor corrected. A good one. Someone who can't be intimidated. She pulled out the sealed envelope from Robert's safe, the one marked for attorney. Her hands were shaking so badly, Marcus had to help her open it. Inside was a single business card and a note in Robert's handwriting. Simon Klein, criminal defense attorney, Oklahoma City. He knows about the Brennan case. I briefed him before I got too sick. He's expecting you if something happens. He can't be bought. R. Eleanor looked at the card at the name printed in simple black letters. Robert had planned this. Even in his final days, he'd been building a safety net for her. Call him, she told Marcus. Now, get him on retainer and get him working on Dylan's case. Eleanor, a lawyer like this is going to be expensive. I don't care. Whatever it takes. She looked around at the destroyed camp, at the people who'd stayed to help her when they had no reason to. They took my house. They're trying to take my land. They won't take these people. Marcus made the call, and 30 minutes later, attorney Simon Klein's voice came through the phone speaker, calm and professional. Ms. Hayes, Robert told me you might call. I'm sorry for your loss. He was murdered, Eleanor said bluntly. And the people who killed him are trying to destroy me now. One of my friends was just arrested on planted drug charges. Dylan Turner, age 19, warrant out of Texas for assault. I already pulled the case file. Your friend is right to be worried. Texas is pushing for extradition. Can you help him? I can fight the drug charges, probably get them dismissed. The Texas warrant is trickier, but it's old, and the victim didn't pursue it aggressively. I might be able to get it reduced or dismissed entirely if Dylan's willing to do community service. He is, whatever it takes. Good. I'll file motions tonight. But Ms. Hayes, you need to understand something. Sheriff Blackwood isn't going to stop. This is just the beginning. I know. And you still want to fight. Eleanor looked at the chaos around her, at the people rebuilding their camp, even as twilight fell at Marcus standing beside her like a sentinel at the foundation of her destroyed house, where Robert's dreams and her stubbornness had built a life. Mr. Klein, they killed my husband for trying to expose them. They let people die in a tornado for profit. They're trying to steal my land and destroy anyone who helps me. If I don't fight, who will? Klein was quiet for a moment. Then Robert said, you were the strongest person he'd ever met. I'm beginning to see why. All right, Ms. Hayes, I'm in. All the way. But you need to be smart about this. They're going to come at you hard. Let them come, Eleanor said. I'm not going anywhere. The next morning, Frank Morrison arrived for his inspection with 3 deputies and a camera crew. Not News County documentation, he claimed, though everyone knew it was insurance against accusations later. Eleanor met them at what used to be her front gate, Marcus, and 12 other angels flanking her like an honor guard. Mr. Morrison, Eleanor said pleasantly, right on time. Morrison looked at the assembled bikers with distaste. This is an official inspection. I don't need an audience. You brought your own audience, Eleanor pointed at the county camera. I'm just ensuring transparency. These gentlemen will observe from a respectful distance. Mrs. Hayes, my property, my rules. You can conduct your inspection with witnesses present, or you can leave and explain to the state investigators why you refuse to do your job in front of cameras. Morrison's face reddened, but he couldn't argue, not without making it obvious this was about something other than safety. The inspection was theater, and both sides knew it. Morrison examined the basement shelter that had saved 80 lives and found it structurally unsound. He measured the foundation that had weathered 60 years of Oklahoma weather and declared it compromised. He tested the soil that had supported crops and buildings for generations and determined it showed signs of instability. Eleanor let him perform, documenting everything on her phone. Every measurement, every notation, every time Morrison discovered a problem that wasn't there yesterday. Finally, Morrison straightened up, brushing dirt from his pants, and pulled out a pre-printed form. Mrs. Hayes, based on my assessment, I'm issuing a temporary condemnation order. This property is unsafe for habitation. On what grounds? The basement structure shows significant stress fractures. The foundation has shifted. The soil composition suggests possible sinkhole formation. The lack of utilities creates health hazards. Do you want me to continue? Yes, actually, because I had a structural engineer examine the property yesterday. Would you like to see his report? Eleanor pulled out a folder James Reeves had helped her obtain containing a professional assessment from a licensed engineer. The report contradicted everything Morrison was claiming. Morrison barely glanced at it. County assessments take precedence over private evaluations. Even when the private evaluation meets state standards and the county assessment is clearly biased. Mrs. Hayes, you're not in a position to make accusations. She doesn't have to, a new voice interrupted. We'll do it for her. Everyone turned. Walking across the field toward them was a woman in a state-issue jacket identification badge visible on her chest. Behind her, 2 more people in similar jackets carrying clipboards and cameras. Jennifer Shaw, Oklahoma Department of Emergency Management, the woman said, extending her hand to Eleanor. We received your complaint about the siren system failure. I'm here to investigate. Morrison's face went from red to pale. This isn't a good time. I'm conducting an inspection. Perfect timing then, Shaw said cheerfully. We can coordinate. I'll need to see your assessment notes, Mr. Morrison, and I'll be conducting my own evaluation of the property safety claims. That's not necessary. It's required under state protocol when siren failures result in property damage and loss of life. Shaw's pleasant tone didn't change, but her eyes were steel. I'm sure you want to cooperate with a state investigation. Morrison looked at the deputies flanking him, at Eleanor's camera, at Marcus and the angels watching with predatory interest. He was trapped, and he knew it. Of course, he said tightly, happy to cooperate. The state investigators spent 3 hours examining not just Eleanor's property, but the documentation around the siren failure, the county's emergency protocols, and the timeline of building inspections following the tornado. Shaw was thorough, methodical, and utterly professional. She asked Morrison pointed questions he struggled to answer convincingly. By noon, she had enough. Mrs. Hayes, Shaw said, pulling Eleanor aside, I'm suspending the county's condemnation order pending further investigation. Your property appears structurally sound for temporary habitation. Not permanent residence, not yet, but camping with proper facilities is acceptable. Thank you, Eleanor said, feeling relief wash through her. Don't thank me yet. This investigation is going to take months, and it's going to get ugly. There's evidence of systematic negligence in the siren system maintenance, possibly deliberate. People at the county level are going to be very unhappy. People at the county level have been unhappy with me since this started. Shaw smiled grimly. Then they're about to be even unhappier. I saw your news interview. You handled yourself well. Keep doing that. Public attention is your best protection right now. After Shaw and her team left, Morrison departed without another word, his camera crew following. Eleanor stood in the middle of her property, surrounded by people who'd become allies, and allowed herself one moment of victory. But only one moment, because Marcus was holding his phone and his expression was grim. Klein just called. They moved Dylan to county lockup. Texas is pushing hard for extradition. Klein thinks Blackwood is expediting it to remove Dylan before Klein can fight the drug charges. Eleanor's moment of victory evaporated. How long do we have? Hearing is tomorrow morning. If the judge approves extradition, Dylan's on a bus to Texas by afternoon. Can Klein stop it? He's going to try. But judges tend to defer to other states on warrant matters. The assault charge is real, Eleanor. Dylan ran instead of facing it. That's not going to look good. Eleanor thought hard. Dylan had been arrested on her property to punish her. If he was extradited, it would scatter the angels, prove Blackwood's power, and isolate her further. She couldn't let that happen. I'm going to the hearing, she said. Eleanor, I'm going. And I'm bringing witnesses. And media. They want to make Dylan an example. Fine. Let's make it a very public example. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the county courthouse with Marcus and 30 angels. They didn't wear their cuts. Klein had advised against that, but everyone knew who they were. News vans from 3 stations were already present, tipped off by anonymous calls from people Eleanor would never meet, but would be forever grateful to. The courthouse security tried to limit the number of people allowed in the courtroom, but Klein argued successfully that it was a public hearing and couldn't be arbitrarily restricted. They filled the gallery, a silent wall of support. Dylan was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look even younger. His eyes found Eleanor's, and something in his expression broke her heart. Fear, yes, but also resignation. Like he'd always known this moment would come, had been waiting for it his whole young life. Judge Patricia Cartwright presided, a severe woman in her 60s who Eleanor vaguely remembered from church functions years ago. She examined the extradition request with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen 1,000 such cases. Mr. Turner, Judge Cartwright said, you're wanted in Texas on a warrant for aggravated assault. The requesting state has provided proper documentation. Do you contest the validity of the warrant? Dylan stood Klein beside him. No, Your Honor, but I request the opportunity to address the court regarding circumstances. Cartwright frowned. This isn't a trial, Mr. Turner. This is an extradition hearing. Your circumstances are irrelevant to whether Texas has a legal right to compel your return. Your Honor, Klein interjected smoothly. While extradition is largely procedural, you do have discretion in cases involving young offenders with evidence of rehabilitation. I'd like to present that evidence. You'd like to argue he shouldn't face consequences for fleeing justice. I'd like to argue he deserves consideration for the person he's become, not just the person he was at 17. Cartwright considered, then nodded curtly. 5 minutes, Mr. Klein. Klein presented quickly and efficiently Dylan's time with the Angels, the community service he'd done, the steady job he'd held before the gang trouble started. Character references from Marcus, from business owners in Tulsa who'd employed him, from a high school teacher who remembered a smart kid who'd gotten lost. And then Klein called Eleanor. She walked to the stand feeling every one of her 76 years, but she kept her back straight and her voice steady. Mrs. Hayes Klein said, "How do you know Dylan Turner?" "He saved my life. When the tornado hit, he was one of 79 people who took shelter in my basement. During the storm, I had a panic attack. Dylan talked me through it, held my hand in the dark while the world was ending outside. He was kind when he didn't have to be. And you've had opportunity to observe his character since. Every day. He's been helping rebuild my property. He works harder than anyone volunteers for the difficult jobs checks on the elderly, folks in town who need assistance. He's a good person trying very hard to escape a bad past." "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes." Klein turned to Judge Cartwright. "Your Honor, we're not asking you to dismiss Texas's warrant. We're asking you to allow Dylan to resolve it here first on his own terms with representation and support rather than being shipped back in chains." The prosecutor, a tired-looking man who was clearly just going through motions, stood up. "Your Honor, the defendant fled justice. His current good behavior doesn't change that. Texas has a right to extradite, and this court should honor that right." "Actually," a voice said from the back of the courtroom, "we don't." Everyone turned. A man in a Texas State Trooper uniform was standing holding identification. "Trooper Michael Chen, Texas Department of Public Safety. I've been authorized to speak regarding this matter." Judge Cartwright frowned. "Trooper, this is highly irregular." "Yes, ma'am, but the victim in the assault case, Mr. James Rodriguez, has submitted a formal request to drop charges. He's provided a sworn statement saying the fight was mutual, that he initiated it, and that he doesn't wish to pursue the matter further." Silence filled the courtroom. Furthermore, Trooper Chen continued, "The warrant was issued when Mr. Turner failed to appear for arraignment. But given the victim's request and Mr. Turner's age, at the time the DA's office is willing to dismiss if Mr. Turner completes anger management courses and community service in his home state." Klein looked stunned. Eleanor felt tears threatening. Dylan's face went from resignation to shock to cautious hope. "Your Honor," Klein said quickly, "if Texas is willing to accept resolution without extradition, we request this court facilitate that arrangement." Judge Cartwright looked at Dylan for a long moment. Then, "Mr. Turner, this is a second chance most people don't get. Don't waste it." "I won't, Your Honor," Dylan's voice cracked. "I swear I won't." "Then I'm denying the extradition request and remanding you to local custody for processing. You'll be released on your own recognizance pending completion of the anger management program and 200 hours of community service. Mr. Klein will file the formal agreement with Texas." The gavel fell. Eleanor didn't remember walking out of the courtroom, but suddenly she was in the hallway, and Dylan was there no longer in the orange jumpsuit, but in his own clothes, and he was hugging her like she was his grandmother, his mother, his salvation. "Thank you," he kept saying. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Marcus appeared beside them. "How did that happen? Who got to the victim?" "I did," a woman's voice said. Eleanor turned to find a woman in her 40s, professional clothes, tired eyes. She looked vaguely familiar. "Sarah Mitchell," the woman said. "I work for the county, or I did until 2 days ago when I was fired for helping you." Eleanor remembered the woman who'd whispered warnings in the county building. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." "Don't be. Getting fired was the best thing that happened to me." Sarah smiled bitterly. "My father worked with your husband. He died in a car accident 3 years ago, but it wasn't an accident. He was investigating the same things Robert was, and Blackwood's people killed him." Eleanor felt the pieces clicking into place. "That's why you helped me. That's why I've been collecting evidence for 3 years. And that's why I spent the last week tracking down Dylan's victim and convincing him to drop the charges." Sarah pulled out a folder. "I also have something you need." Inside the folder were emails, dozens of them all between Sheriff Blackwood, Frank Morrison, and Victor Brennan, discussing properties to target insurance claims to complicate families, to pressure. The conspiracy laid out in black and white. "Where did you get these?" Eleanor breathed. "County email server. I had administrative access before they fired me. Downloaded everything I could before they revoked my credentials." "This is," Eleanor looked at Klein, who was reading over her shoulder. "This is enough, isn't it?" "This is more than enough," Klein said quietly. "This is prosecution-level evidence. Federal prosecution." "Good," Sarah said. "Because I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of watching these people destroy lives, and I'm ready to testify." Over the next week, several things happened very quickly. Attorney Klein filed criminal complaints with both state and federal authorities supported by Robert's evidence, Sarah's emails, and James Reeves's investigative report. The FBI opened an investigation into public corruption and disaster fraud. The news coverage intensified. Eleanor's story became regional, then national. An elderly widow fighting a corrupt sheriff supported by a motorcycle club exposing systemic disaster capitalism. It was exactly the kind of narrative that captured public attention. Brennan Development's lawyers issued statements denying everything. Victor Brennan himself held a press conference claiming he was being targeted by radical elements trying to derail legitimate economic development. And Sheriff Blackwood continued to insist he was simply doing his job in difficult circumstances. But the pressure was building. Other families started coming forward, people who'd been forced to sell their properties after disasters, who'd faced sudden insurance problems and condemnation orders. The pattern was undeniable. 3 weeks after Dillon's hearing, the first arrests were made. Not Blackwood, he was too well protected for immediate action, but 2 of his deputies, including Kyle Foster, on charges of evidence tampering and false imprisonment related to the planted drugs in Dillon's tent. Morrison was suspended from his position pending investigation. And Victor Brennan, for all his lawyers and press conferences, was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and securities violations related to his company's disaster investments. Eleanor watched it unfold from her property where the foundation of a new house was being laid by a crew of angels who decided to stay and help. The community had transformed its perception of them from dangerous outsiders to heroes who'd stood with one of their own. But Eleanor knew the real fight wasn't over. Blackwood was still sheriff, still had power, still had connections. He wouldn't go down easily. The confrontation came on a gray morning in June, 2 months after the tornado. Eleanor was supervising the framing of her new house when she saw the vehicles coming. Not patrol cars this time. FBI sedans, state police cruisers, and in the middle of them, a familiar county SUV. The vehicles stopped at the edge of her property. Federal agents emerged first, followed by state troopers. And then Sheriff Warren Blackwood, this time in handcuffs. FBI agent Rivera approached Eleanor, professional and courteous. "Mrs. Hayes, I wanted you to see this personally. Warren Blackwood has been arrested on federal charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of civil rights, and second-degree murder in the death of Robert Hayes." Eleanor's breath caught. Murder, you can prove it. The pharmacy records, combined with testimony from the pharmacist who's cooperating to avoid prosecution, established that Blackwood ordered the tampering of your husband's medications. It may have taken 2 months to get all the evidence, but we got it. Eleanor looked at Blackwood. He was staring at her with undisguised hatred, all pretense of authority stripped away. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the handcuffs and the badges surrounding him. "You should have sold," Blackwood said, voice bitter. "Would have been easy. Taken the money, moved on. But you had to be stubborn, had to fight." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I did. Your husband died because he couldn't mind his own business. You almost followed him, but I didn't. That's the difference between almost and actually, Sheriff. You almost got away with it." Blackwood was led away, still muttering threats and grievances. Agent Rivera stayed behind. "This is going to trial," she told Eleanor. "We'll need you to testify. It won't be easy." "I didn't expect easy," Eleanor said. "I expected necessary." Rivera smiled slightly. "Your husband would be proud." "My husband would be annoyed that I was right about keeping the house," Eleanor corrected. But her voice broke on the words, and for the first time since Robert's letter, she let herself cry. Marcus found her 20 minutes later, sitting on a stack of lumber tears drying on her face in the morning sun. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm angry," Eleanor said. "Angry that Robert died thinking I'd never know why. Angry that he tried to protect me by keeping secrets. Angry that he's not here to see this. He knows." "You don't believe that?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but it's a nice thought anyway." They sat in silence watching the construction crew work. Dillon was up on the frame, young and strong and alive, hammering boards with fierce concentration. The house rising around them was smaller than the old one, but solid, built to last. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," Eleanor thought about that. "Now I rebuild. Testify when the trials start. Try to help other families who got caught in Blackwood's schemes." She looked at Marcus. "And I keep a shelter available in my basement for the next tornado, because there's always another storm coming. We'll help. With all of it." "You don't have to. The debt's paid," Marcus, "more than paid." "This isn't about debt anymore," Marcus said. "This is about family." Eleanor looked around at the angels working on her house at Dillon, laughing at something someone said at Sarah Mitchell, pulling up in her car with lunch for everyone. At the community that had built itself from disaster and stubbornness and the simple refusal to let cruelty win. "Yeah," she said softly, "I suppose it is." The trials took 8 months. Blackwood was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Victor Brennan got 15 years, and was ordered to pay restitution to the families he'd defrauded. Morrison cut a deal and testified against both of them, receiving probation and permanent banishment from public service. Dylan completed his anger management program and community service. He enrolled in community college studying to become an EMT. He still lived on Eleanor's property in a small cabin the Angels had built, and everyone knew he wasn't leaving anytime soon. Sarah Mitchell started a nonprofit helping disaster survivors navigate insurance claims and property rights. It was funded partially by the restitution money and partially by donations from people who'd been inspired by Eleanor's story. Marcus and his chapter of Hell's Angels became permanent fixtures in the county, their reputation transformed from dangerous outlaws to community protectors. They organized disaster response training, maintained the tornado warning system as volunteers, and established a shelter network for vulnerable residents. And Eleanor Hayes, 76 years old with Parkinson's disease in a house that was too big for one person, opened her basement shelter to the community every tornado season. The sign at her gate read, Hayes Haven. When storms come, we stand together. She kept Robert's letter in a frame on her wall next to a photo of him looking annoyed at some long-forgotten irritation. Sometimes late at night, she'd talk to that photo, telling him about her day, about the people she'd helped, about the community they'd accidentally built. You were right about one thing, she'd say. The house was too much for me alone. But it turns out I'm not alone. One evening in late summer, Eleanor sat on her new porch, wider than the old one built, to hold more people watching the sunset paint the wheat fields gold. Marcus came up the steps with 2 glasses of lemonade, moving a little slower these days, his own years catching up with him. Big crowd expected tomorrow, he said, handing her a glass. Tornado drill, first one the county's run in 5 years. Good, Eleanor said. About time they took it seriously. Dylan's leading the youth education program. Kid's a natural teacher. He reminds me of my grandson, what he could have been if someone had helped him soon enough. They sat in comfortable silence, watching day fade to dusk. Fireflies began their nightly dance across the fields. Somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine rumbled. You ever regret it? Marcus asked. Fighting instead of just taking Brennan's buyout would have been easier. Eleanor thought about that, really thought about it. She thought about losing Robert, losing her home, nearly losing everything, about the fear and exhaustion and moments when she'd wanted to surrender. But then she thought about Dylan, about Sarah, about the families who'd gotten their money back, about the warning system that now worked, about the community that had learned it could fight back against corruption and win. No, she said finally, easy isn't always right. Robert taught me that, even if I was too stubborn to hear it while he was alive. Think he'd be proud. Eleanor looked at the photo through the window at Robert's annoyed expression, frozen in time. I think he'd say I told you so about the house being too big. Then he'd be proud. A car pulled into the drive. A family Eleanor recognized from town, bringing their elderly mother to see the shelter, wanting to make sure she knew where to go when the next storm came. Because there would be a next storm. There was always a next storm. But Eleanor had learned something important in the months since the tornado. Storms didn't have to destroy you. Sometimes if you were stubborn enough, brave enough, lucky enough to have help, when you needed it most, storms could forge you into something stronger than you'd been before. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady, and went to greet her visitors. Come in, Eleanor Hayes said, her words carrying across the prairie evening. You're welcome here. You're safe here. And in the basement below the shelter waited. Strong walls built by stubborn love, a refuge against storms both literal and metaphorical, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most powerful resistance was simply refusing to be moved. Above ground, the community gathered. Below ground, the safety held. And somewhere between earth and sky, in the space where courage lived, an old woman who'd lost everything and gained a family stood watch. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. Eleanor tilted her face toward it, unafraid. Let the storms come. She would be ready. They all would be ready. Together.